Augustine's life. And I opened the book and I just fell in love with this dynamic, exciting, useful, helpful, life-giving virtue. And I was like, where have you been all my life? This is an amazing way to think about living. And I asked myself, how did we end up here from here? How did something really gorgeous and rich end up at this place where it's considered kind of old and stale? And so I spent my dissertation teasing that question out and thinking about, is there a way we could think about this in a new way? So traditionally, temperance is thought of as the virtue that manages the desires for food, alcohol, and sexual activity. That goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, some of the really big names in classical philosophy. Aristotle is the one that people usually think of when they say, what is virtue? And he says Aristotle loved to categorize things. He loved to divide and subdivide and subdivide. And he said it's about the pleasures that are of our senses, but not just that, it's the pleasures of touch. But it's only the pleasures of touch that have to do with food, drink, and sexual activity. He said it's not the pleasures of touch like from exercising or getting a massage at the gymnasium or sun tanning out in the sun in the summer. It's about these particular pleasures that we share with animals. And that was really kind of a dirty word. It was that was not a compliment. It was a sense of, even the animals want to eat and procreate. And so we share these with them. And so it's kind of the shameful part of ourselves because the essence of our virtue is our soul. And our soul, which is rational, and our bodies are irrational. They're going to be out of control if we let them have their own way at all. And so they said temperance is the virtue that helps the rational soul control the irrational desires. I know, sorry I missed Kevin Brown's talk last week, but I know he talked quite a bit about desire. And desire is one way that folks have talked about the things that temperance controls, the desires for food, especially for humans. With animals, you might say it's instinct. They kind of sense we need to eat, we need to procreate to keep the wolves going, the wolf pack going. For us, it can become something different. It can become like a desire. It can be pursued out of order. I know we also talked about ordered love with Augustine. And so Plato and Aristotle, who valued the rational contemplation and soul very highly, they said temperance means that we can't let the body and its animal desires ruin the rest of our lives. And we got to keep them under control. Plato had this really strong image of a charioteer, and it was being pulled by these two horses, and one of the horses was our physical appetites. And he said, temperance is like the charioteer holding the horse that wants to run away, but we need it to carry us along. We need its power, but it can't be in control. And so that was a big part of what temperance was considered to be, was the control of the soul over the appetites. But also it had this really nice intellectual meaning, which was this idea of knowing yourself and acting accordingly. I almost said the British word, I don't know where that came from, but the Greek word, sophrosyne, if you break down the word, it literally means sound mind. And that's a really nice thing to think about. It means you're sound-minded in the ways in which you comport yourself. So alongside this idea of temperance as a self-control that monitors our physical appetites, it's also this sense of sound-mindedness. Plato talked about this oracle. There was an oracle of Delphi. It was very important to them. It's just like at Asbury, the black ones don't work. There's this oracle here, and there were these kind of signs up on each side that were supposed to kind of set the pace and the mood when you went in. And this one said, know thyself. And this one said, nothing in excess. And so for Plato and the early Greeks, this was the idea. These two are supposed to kind of work hand in hand. You know yourself, and by knowing yourself, you will recognize when you're in excess, and you won't go to excess. So this sense of controlling our appetites, but also knowing who and what we are. So interesting, like before Socrates, back in like the Greek heroic times, if you've ever read the Greek myths of Zeus and these folks, and a common theme in those myths is that humans try to do too much. They try to get above their raising, get above their station, and the gods squash them. The gods are like, let me show you that you're not a god. I'm going to, turn you into a newt, or I'm going to turn you into a tree because you've dared to think you're a god. That was also a rule by the virtue of temperance. It was a sense of not being arrogant, not being hubristic, not thinking that you are more than you are. And I promise that will become significant in a minute. I'm not just bringing it up for an interesting point. So then we get on through, the Stoics were sort of the next big philosophical group, and they focus quite a bit on temperance as self-control and being able to make good choices, controlling your desires so you would make good choices. And then we get to the early Christian tradition, and these folks are influenced tremendously, obviously, by the scriptures, but also most of them had studied classical philosophy of one form or another. And so as they're formulating sort of the moral theology of the early church, we'll talk about Augustine as the biggest example, but these others, they are interacting with these Greek and Roman virtue categories. They're living in the middle of these Roman contexts, these Hellenistic Greek-like contexts, and so they're having to explain their own lives in a way that, in terms that the other folks can understand, and yet figure out some way to be distinctive. And so they start using these terms that Plato and Aristotle have used and said, well, yeah, we know what temperance is. We know how to control our appetites. We know what courage is. And so they took temperance and really turned it into this sense of seeking purity. Above all things, the emphasis in the early church on purity, virginity, even when married couples, I know one thing that Augustine talked about was that when married couples came into the church, they were very often encouraged to live celibately as brother and sister, because they said all desires really are not what we're supposed to be living in now with God. And Augustine said, let's hold on a second. So there's this sense of people in the church trying to figure out what to do with these virtues that have been given to them in the culture, and also in this particularly Christian with the scriptures and the relationship with Christ. So Augustine does this interesting thing. Augustine looks down and he says, this seems to make sense. These virtues seem to make a lot of sense. But we know that the ultimate good for us is not our soul and contemplation, and glorifying ourselves and becoming more virtuous so we're so proud. He says virtue is the perfect love of God. All virtue is the perfect love of God. And then it plays out in these different ways. Really revolutionary. And he says, so temperance, it is about our appetites, but he said what it's really about at its core is keeping ourselves incorrupt and whole for God. Augustine had this thing where he felt like he was being pulled in different directions by his appetites, and he wanted to be brought together and be whole and given as a whole person to God. And he said, this is what temperance does. It helps us keep ourselves whole, not giving pieces of ourselves away to anybody that asks, and incorrupt. We are whole and pure to be given to God. So that's an exciting way to think about our virtues as forms of love for God. Aquinas was kind of the next person, and Aquinas, this is really interesting to think about Aquinas. He's still very formational for the Catholic Church. Most Catholic theology a lot of it is hinged directly on Aquinas' work. And so Aquinas was really a really learned friar, and he came into the training to be a friar, and they were basically given these lists of, Christian morality means here's a list of things you don't do. Just memorize that and you'll be good. And Aquinas said, that doesn't seem encouraging or even theologically sound. And so what he did is he wrote this huge book. And if you've seen it in the library, it's like this much on the shelf, maybe. It's huge, and it's called the Summa Theologica, which basically means the sum of all theology. If you've read it, you get a pretty good stab at it. He covers a lot of stuff. And he says, there are two things to our lives as Christians. he says, we have the reality. The first book, this thing is written in 3 parts. And the first part is who God is. And he spends a long time talking about who is God? What is God? God is being itself. God creates. God is goodness. And then the third book is about the person and work of Jesus. And in the middle, part 2 is where he talks about morality and virtue. Because he says, look, for Christians, who we are to be and what we are to do only makes sense if it's wrapped up in the reality of who we are in God. Starting from God, the Father who creates all things, and then being redeemed and pulled back through Christ's redemption. And so he then takes that and says, so temperance is, taking care of your appetites and whatnot, but it's so we can really be living this life that's tranquil and beautiful as God wanted us to do and as redemption helps us to do. So he wants to say, well, it is about, not drinking to excess, not having food to excess, having the right sexual relationships. He brought up something that was very interesting as well, especially with food. I was thinking about this when I watched Kevin Brown's presentation, is that we're used to thinking of gluttony as just too much, just too many hot dogs or burgers at the cookout when Josh does this. But Aquinas, following on Albert the Great, they said really gluttony is much more nuanced than that. It's about doing things with the right amount, if you want to eat the right number of burgers, in the right way. You don't want to eat too greedily. You don't want to gobble because that's not what food is designed for. You don't want to eat at the wrong time, in the wrong way. Just like with sexuality, it's not just about what you do or don't do, but it's about participating with the right person, in the right situation, with the right spirit. And so that's an interesting way to think about controlling our appetites. It's not just the sense of, as long as I don't eat too much, I'm good. Or as long as I don't get drunk, I'm good. Or, as long as I don't just commit adultery, I'm good. It's much more a sense of finding the ways to do it right in ways that honor God and honor God's intention. So when we think about food, it's a sense of, I'll talk about this at the end, but this sense of what's the purpose of food? And when Kevin Brown talked about gluttony, there's a sense that gluttony is, if you sit down at a table and you eat all this food, well, number one, you're missing the purpose. Food is not about stuffing ourselves. It's not just about keeping alive. It's about celebrating the gift God gives us. It's about sharing table fellowship. And so to be able to think about how do we honor those ways of eating well and living well with our appetites. It's not just letting our appetites roam free, and it's not just shoving them down because they're so dangerous. It's a sense of how do we live in a way that's right and that's pleasing to God and reflects God. We'll skip Calvin and Wesley because they didn't add a ton. But Wesley actually was very interesting. Wesley dealt with things with temperance in terms of like meekness and humility. These were really big categories for John Wesley. Meekness, humility, self-control, and self-denial were things he thought were very important to live a disciplined Christian life and to allow the holy tempers of generosity, of love for others, of love for God and neighbor to flourish. And if you didn't have your appetites managed well, you couldn't really love God and others well because your appetites would get in the way. Sorry, I'm just kind of going through here. These categories appear in Scripture. There's 2 basic words that get translated as temperance. I had to do an article one time on temperance in Scripture and the tradition, and it was very confusing because you get to, the Greeks talk about these in really different ways, and you get to Scripture and it all becomes this muddle, and you try to think about what is temperance and what is self-control. Basically in Scripture, these words reflect some of the big meanings that we've seen throughout all the tradition. Sobriety, sound-mindedness, and mental clarity is a really common translation of this Greek word that was translated as temperance. The the demon-possessed man in the 5th book of Mark. When Paul says folks need to be in their right mind to strengthen the brethren, he says, if I'm out of my mind, it's for Christ. If I'm in my right mind, it's for y'all. Believers should be serious and self-disciplined and teachable. The sense of being self-disciplined, being able to control ourselves so that our minds will be sound and we can be taught good doctrine. Wesley talked about that some in his sermons on riches, and then why Christianity was not very effective. And he said, we can be taught all the doctrine we want, but if we don't practice self-denial and self-discipline, doctrine's not going to have its full effect, because we'll be so crowded out by these desires. We'll be drunk or satiated from food. We'll need a nap after our huge Thanksgiving meal. And we need to be able to practice self-control and monitoring ourselves. So it's linked with things like knowledge and endurance. Sober self-assessment as a path to unity within the fellowship. I think that's a really neat, that's a neat word. Right there at the beginning of Romans 12, do not be conformed to the desires of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so this idea of know thyself that we said from Plato, a sober, realistic self-assessment that then leads you to have greater unity with the body. The other big meaning that we see that throughout the tradition, it's present in Scripture a lot, is self-control. So probably if we'd said abstinence from alcohol and then we said moderation in all things, there's another sort of primary meaning that folks tend to take away from temperance, and that's the idea of self-control. Don't let your appetites are going to run wild if you don't keep a strict rein on them. So keep them tamped down, because if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And so this idea of self-control, Paul talks about it quite a bit in the 1st book of Corinthians. Talk about abstaining from sexual activity for a purpose. It's linked to training, self-discipline, and fruitful victory. Required for bishops, and one of the fruits of the Spirit. It's the last one mentioned, but self-control and temperance as one of the fruits of the Spirit is really gorgeous. So basically, I was doing this dissertation and I thought, well, what do you do? This seems like a virtue that could be really important for our lives, but I don't know how to pull it. Can it be redeemed or maybe refreshed? Because if you say temperance and everyone's like, so I got to stop, I've got to swear off all alcohol, I've got to do everything in moderation. No one is, that doesn't seem to be a compelling way to shape our moral lives. And so I looked through all the work that had been done on temperance, and there were some really interesting things that appeared over and over and over and over through all these people. And if you look at the list, like Plato down through Wesley, very, very different people. If you look at Augustine and Aquinas, who really loved the virtue ethics tradition, and then you go to Luther and Calvin, and they're like, virtue ethics sounds pretty Catholic to me. We are not going to fool with that. But even they had these ideas of what temperance might be, this idea of controlling oneself. And so I went through all these people, and I pulled out these words that seemed to appear over and over and over, and thought, if we brought these 4 things together, this would be a really interesting way to think about how to incorporate our desires in a way God intends to us. So those things, the first one was self-control. So pretty obvious. Living a moral life is going to involve some avenue of self-control. It is, and that's pretty, I think everyone knows that. We struggle against it sometimes, but there's always times when we think, I want to do this, but I shouldn't do it, and so I won't do it. And in itself, that's not a bad thing. It's part of our lives. But to say that all the temperance and being well regulated with our desires is all it is self-control is not only not very rich, it's not very helpful. Number one, it's really hard to maintain that for a long time. If you think about, there was this experiment that someone did with dogs, and they were trying to test a dog's capacity to regulate itself, its self-control. They'd bring a dog in, they'd put a treat or a steak or something here, and they'd say, sit. And the dog would sit, it can see the treat, it's hungry. And then they would leave the room. And they wanted to see how long the dog would stay sitting before it said, forget it, I'm going to get the treat. And so they would do these experiments. And they realized that the longer and they would try some other commands with them. And they said, the longer that you made the dogs wait just out of control, the less responsive they were later. And they said it's kind of like a muscle. Like if you're using so much effort to control yourself, you're going to leave all your game there. You're going to be tired out. And when something else comes up you might need to exercise some self-control with, you may not have anything left. So self-control is important, but on its own, it's not adequate. And besides that, it's not a pleasant way to live. No one wants to go through life just gritting their teeth, being like, oh, I just really want to eat that cookie, but I swore off cookies for life because they're bad for me. And this goes back to something Aristotle said. He did a really interesting thing with virtue, and I think it shows up in temperance, because temperance is concerned with things that are pleasurable: food, a glass of wine, sexual activity. And he said, if we're exercising, we possess real virtue, we're going to find it pleasant. And they said, what do you mean? And he said, well, if all you're doing is gritting your teeth and saying no and stamping down your desires, that indicates that you're not really aligned well with desiring the right thing. For Christians, we would say things like, we don't yet have sort of the mind of Christ, or we don't have the sanctification happening inside of us. It's better to not do the bad thing than to do it, but it's better yet to avoid the bad thing because it's distasteful to you. It feels good to do the right thing. And so that was something that we can blend in with self-control, as if self-control is important, but on its own, it's not a happy way to live, not the way God designed us. The next thing was self-knowledge. So we kind of go from controlling ourselves to knowing ourselves. But it's really fascinating to me, because I think when we think about how to control our appetites and how to work with our appetites, very often we're trying to find someone to give us the answer. You see this in like diet plans. It's like, just tell me the way to lose weight. Just tell me what, grapefruit diet to follow, or whatever worked for you, and I'm going to adopt that because I need someone to tell me how to control myself. The problem is, it doesn't always work. Aristotle talked about that too. He said, we should all eat the right amount of food. He goes, but what does that mean? I mean, you've got a wrestler over here, and you've got a young man who's studying all the time over here. Do they need the same amount of food? What's right for one won't be right for the other. And so you have to figure out what's the particular thing that is needed. And so that's where he says it's got to be pleasurable. You've got to be able to be happy and pleasant and fulfilled in not doing the wrong thing. And you need to know what that is. We need to know ourselves well enough to say, this is the right amount for me. This is the right thing for me. The next one, I'm going to skip one and go to the next one. The next one is humility. Humility was a really interesting one. Humility is this idea that we don't try to take more than we need, because we are not just focused on ourselves. We think about gluttony or adultery or any of these other things, and you might think it's all about me, me, me. What do I want right now? I want all the food right now. I want, the person that I find attractive right now. Humility says it's not about what I want. It's about being other-focused, other-centered. What does anyone else want to eat? Maybe someone would like to share this with me. Maybe someone else is hungry, and I will share with them. I won't just think about my needs. And so humility, in a sense of also being grounded, like the idea of keeping your feet on the ground and in reality, so that we don't think, I'm worth everything that there is, and so I should get everything that I want. We remember, we're somebody. We're made of dust like everybody else, and we don't deserve to have our needs catered to. And the fourth one is this idea of a mode or method of life. This is an interesting one. I found it really amazing for how we can use temperance in today's problems in society, because I think oftentimes we don't follow our desires well because we've forgotten what a lot of them are for. We've forgotten what some of the things in our life are for. What's the purpose of food, of a meal? Is it just to fuel ourselves so we can go on and get through the day with enough energy to get through our tasks? Oftentimes folks who have struggled with being overweight and overeating have said, food's fuel to me now. I put in enough to take out what I need, and it works really well for them. That is one purpose and function of food in our life. Others, as Christians, we might say food is a way of celebrating God's creation. What does it mean to go out to an orchard when the peaches are in season and get that one peach and it's perfect and you bite in and the juice goes everywhere and you're just really happy to be alive because God created this gorgeous thing and we get to enjoy it. Food's also a way to celebrate communion with one another, with God. All the times that God did table fellowship with us. It's a great way to celebrate family. Think about the meals we have at Christmas or Thanksgiving or Sunday meals. And so we don't think about food as being something we have to hoard, something that we have to use to give us meaning in life, to give us comfort all the time. One thing we don't have to think about food being is like a value. It's these new values. I'm old enough to remember when the meals at, the fast food things were small. They were moderate. And all of a sudden it became about, this is your best value. Get the huge drink, get the huge fries, because you won't pay as much and it's the best value. And we think, I got to get the best value. And so we start thinking that food is about maximizing our value and not enjoying it the way we're supposed to enjoy it. We talked just in a minute about consumption. We forget about things like, what is a car for? What is a house for? What is sexual activity for? Is it for connecting with other people in the bonds of marriage? And so how does that shape our desires? And so all these things together, these four things, self-control, self-knowledge, a mode or method in life, and humility, come together to create what I think is this perfect idea of temperance, which is a harmonious order. This sense of everything being ordered in a harmonious way. Order can be any number of things. You can have order that's fear-based. You can have order that's just kind of very sterile and you always do things the exact same way. Or you can have an order that is more like a symphony. And Plato talked about temperance as a symphony or a harmony. And if you think about going to a symphony, and no instrument there is unimportant. Each one does its role at its appointed time. And that's what's gorgeous about symphony or harmony, is it creates something that's not just sort of safe, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. Bringing these different things together in their right proportions at the right time creates something that's beautiful and blesses everyone. So temperance really is this idea of getting our physical appetites together, our physical desires, our mind, our disciplines, all these things together to make our lives into a beautiful harmony that really just we're happy to participate in because it feels good. It brings beauty to others. And just really quickly, one reason that people said I shouldn't do my dissertation on this virtue is they said, well, it's kind of like it's kind of limited. It's kind of boring. Food. Well, we can just talk about how much. Just don't eat too much, and with alcohol, just don't drink too much. If you drink at all, with sex, just be monogamous within marriage. But these appetites seem boring, and I think as we've looked at the idea of what are our desires? Like, desires are much bigger than just our physical appetites. We desire things that are not just these things where I've got to satisfy this base instinct for food or sexual activity to procreate. We can look at contemporary food culture. I mentioned that, but the idea of what does it mean to go have a meal somewhere? Is it all about getting the best value? Which I think as Americans, we really like it. That's a hook for us. It's like, I got the best value, it's this much per calorie of food, and if I'd gotten this little one, it would have been more. So I scored big on that. Also, the idea of consumerism. Food consumption is our sort of primary, most basic way to consume, but we really are being shaped into consumers at every level of our lives. We shop for churches now. Sometimes we shop for houses. We consume things we sort of live to consume things. I know Dr. Brown talked last week. I thought I wrote it down, but that amazing quote about advertisers just want to see a desire fulfilled. They don't, but as to the desires themselves, they're strictly, fastidiously neutral. And I think that's something that's important for Christians to think about, is how are our desires being shaped by the world around us? How are they being shaped in terms of shopping, purchasing things, getting a bigger home, buying more and more things and just letting them break and we get another one. My father, we were talking about the houses that I got and my sister got when we got married years ago. And he was commenting that when he and my mother first got married, he was a law student in Texas. And he said, we had one lamp. We had a one-bedroom apartment, and he had a table set on 2 file cabinets. That was his desk for law school. And he said we had one lamp, and we used it in the living room. And when it was time to go to bed, we carried it to the bedroom. And we plugged it in. And he's like, that's all we needed. And he said, it's just funny now that we watch these TV shows and brand new married couples are like, I've got to have a double basin sink, and I've got to have a double oven in my house. And I'm like, what are y'all, like caterers? Like, what do you need these 2 ovens for every day? But we've gotten this idea that a house is not just about function, but it's about prestige and, not ever being crowded together, being able to space out from one another. So the idea of how we consume and how that feeds into our economic systems, I think, is really in the realm of temperance. What are our desires? Are they being shaped well by society? How do we shape them? There's new things in sexuality that we can talk about. This idea of, I teach a class on embodiment. We talk about food and sexuality and disability. And there's this whole thing now of what they call cybersexuality or virtual sexuality. And the question kind of comes up is it adultery or is it sin if there's no one else there with you? Or what if you are playing out your fantasies with a robot or a doll or a virtual reality? Things that are not as these were not the questions that our ancestors were tackling. And so we have to kind of step back and say, what does temperance say about this? We can't go to some of the standard answers don't seem to be adequate anymore. So how do we have to think about what's the purpose of sexuality? It's uniting 2 people under the bond of marriage. Are you might not be strictly breaking a rule by having some virtual reality interaction, but you're not fulfilling what God has said this is about. And then one I want to think about quite a bit in my life coming up is this idea of transhumanism, which is the idea that humanity is going to move past its limits and become something more. It's going to surpass the limitations and weaknesses of humanity. And so that might be things like never aging. It might be things like curing, really enhancing our IQs, our physical strength through different means, living forever possibly. What does it mean to never suffer harm or diseases or breaks of the bone? And just this idea that that the function of the purpose of being human is now shifted a bit. It's supposed to, we view death as the enemy, so the natural thing is if you can outrun death, let's do that. If we have technologies now that can outpace death, then we should do that. And so this idea of how do we moderate our desire for life? How do we moderate our desire, a natural desire to live and stay and pursue experiences and enjoy our families and whatnot? Can that be a disordered, inordinate desire? And similar with gluttony, if we live longer, if we take up more space on the earth, are we depriving others who then might want to come in and live their lives, but they can't because we're still here. The space is still being taken up. How do we know when we've reached the limit and the purpose of our lives and possibly just say it's my time? So this is the really interesting thing that folks are pushing back against, this idea that human life that it's limited and finite, and that's okay, it's by design. And folks are saying, no, why settle for that? Let's be limitless. Let's be limitless. Very much kind of like the Tower of Babel. We can be gods. We can just keep building and we'll just be our own gods. So that's a long time. I've talked for a long time, but I think it's fun. I was looking over the other virtues that were discussed, like chastity and some others. And these sort of nest under the umbrella of temperance, this idea of what does it mean to live our desires well and allow God to shape our desires well, not just squelch them, which is not helpful, but also not the way God wants it. What's the way God would like us to shape our desires, and in a way that our lives become, not every second, but a beautiful harmony. And I think that's a moral vision I feel is exciting. I can get behind that. So, anyway, thank you. Any questions?
What did you have in mind with purity culture and raunch culture?
Oh, yeah, I did write that down. I'm working on that for a book. I think I'm trying to think about how it is that we posture ourselves. We talk about this in my embodiment class, towards the idea of sexuality itself. How can we say that sex and our sexuality is a created good, and yet not, fall totally off one side over here? And because raunch culture is a term that's been used lately for positivity and sexuality, specifically for women, but this idea that we're sexual creatures and it's fine that we're going to live in that all the time and just show that, but then not going the other way towards what's been called purity culture, which is very much a sense of sex is inherently dangerous, and something that's going to lead our lives astray. And then we're supposed to then transition into marriage without understanding what sex is supposed to be about. And so kind of getting back to this, what's the purpose of sex and sexuality? What did God create it for? How did God create it? And so not repressing total sexual desire, but not living in it and flaunting in it. And so I'm doing that because I see that a lot in our culture. I see people in our culture, especially young women, navigating these, who am I supposed to be? How am I supposed to look? What do the clothing choices at Target say about our girls' sexuality? When my girl was growing up, I couldn't find shorts that had more than a 1-inch inseam. And I was like, I just want some shorts. I just want some regular shorts, And they were really hard to find because they were designed to be more revealing. So, how do you... So... Sorry, I know that was a lot. But
I think in Scripture do all this word of God. No matter what you're doing or what you're facing, you check with God. Is this your will or is this our will? Do all His will.
I love that. I was presenting to the faculty at Asbury before I got hired, and they were saying, well, why not just talk about holiness? Why talk about virtue? And I said, well, to me, it really is. They are, in some ways, just different ways of talking about the same thing, like to be sanctified, to be made holy inside, and to live with the mind of Christ and desire what Christ desires. And I thought that's, which will be, it won't be a prison. It will be a free way of moving that is full of safety and goodness and love. And it's another reason I don't care for everything in moderation. I think it makes it sound like anything extreme is bad. But, we don't really the Christianity is not really a moderate faith in all its aspects. I mean, if someone says you got to take up your cross, and when God calls you, bids you come and die, that's not exactly a moderate position. And so there are times for excessive pleasure and excessive, or lots of, it's not just about having a little anger. You can never be too angry. You got to be just angry enough. You can never be too sexually fulfilled. You find some medium. But what does it mean to do things in the right way, and not just the sense of this watered down kind of mediocre? Because God calls us to really, really big things, and we want to live a well-modulated life, a well-conducted life, like a symphony, but we don't want to be just sort of lukewarm. Because for one thing, there's not much energy in that. There's not much, it's harder in some ways to do the big things God calls of us. If we're always worrying about being too excited or too,
You started with rational control of irrational desires. There seems to be what I think is irrational desire created utopia today. That society, the government, that we as humans, through our own efforts, through laws, through whatever, can create a utopia, which to me seems like a very irrational desire. How a lot of what's going on in the world today, we want to self-define ourselves. We want everything is about finding a utopia or happiness in whatever it is we desire. I'm trying to figure out how tolerant, how that fits within this, what's going on in our world.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's hard. I mean, we're trying to have your kingdom come on earth as is in heaven. That's not the utopia that people try to build. But, it's interesting that oftentimes folks that yearn towards these things are really yearning for what maybe rationally we realize we're not going to fully have on earth. And so, how do we accept limitations of that without losing hope and becoming cynical? And as a Christian ethicist, that to me is one of the hardest questions to grapple with. Because I personally don't want to live in a society where there's just too much realism. Like, I'm not a fan of that. I want to see the kingdom coming more and more and more, while still recognizing that we'll never have it done fully, which helps me to guard against despair and cynicism. And it's like the idea of self-identifying. It's interesting the ways in which I think our world pushes us to identify in things other than our createdness in God. I think that a lot of the new sort of this idea of what is happening with gender is one of those. I think that setting up so much of our life around economic and work concerns is more prevalent, because I think it's something that is so pervasive in a way that this identity stuff is not as pervasive. It gets a lot of press, but it's very difficult to extract ourselves from this idea of being workers and consuming and having value in that kind of thing. So I think it's important to pull all these out and examine them all carefully, because there's a lot pulling on us, in my opinion, from a lot of different directions, a lot pulling on us. And it's, we don't want to be given our identity by anything but God. And I think they come and go, and that's my opinion, is they kind of come and go. But that's just, I don't know, that's the thing where I struggle. I'm like, I don't want to have an irrational desire for something I cannot reach, will not be reached in my lifetime. But I'm not sure how much realism I want either. I don't know how much I want that to define the way I posture myself towards the world. Because if we're to be continually moving towards sanctification, I feel like that's something that can bear more and more fruit. That's just where I am. Not everyone agrees with me, but sure. I was thinking about that just today. Yeah, this idea of in terms of like immoderate desire. I wrote this thing on one time. I talked about idealism in Christian community and in Christians, and that idealism is seen to be this unrestrained good. It's unqualified good. Idealism is amazing. Our ideals really lead us forward, but they'll never be fully realized. Which I think as Christians we know better than others. We're always going to be fallen. We're never going to be quite there. And then what happens is we lose all our hope and become very cynical. And we just kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, I'm just going to be cynical and kind of expect nothing good. And I think the idea of moderating our desire, thinking about what is proper desire towards these things can be helpful, because it keeps us from being unrealistic or from despairing. and just kind of going through the motions, which I think is not uncommon for people who believe in a real good like Christians do. My dad had a really bad experience at his church a number of years ago, and he's like, that's it, I'm done caring. I'll keep showing up because I think it's the thing to do, but I'm done, maybe I'll pray when I want to, but me and the church were done. And that was hard, because how do we talk through the fact that churches are frail, and how do we keep a realistic hope and who we're supposed to be?